Can you see my screen, sir?
Yeah.
Cool. What's this? No, whoops. Is that 1 out of 25 thing showing up for you guys as well?
No, I just have
Okay,
your
cool.
El Salvador thing.
All right. So, El Salvador. El Salvador is the smallest nation in Central America and South America as a whole, with an area of 21,041 kilometers squared. The country has a population of 6.421 million people and a GDP of $34.37 billion. The capital of the country is San Salvador, which has a population of 1.1 million people in its greater metropolitan area. Approaching this from a linear perspective, the Pipil tribe were the first inhabitants of the land, having immigrated there from Mexico in 1100 BC and establishing their city of Cuscatlan. This was 400 years prior to Spain's first expedition, which began in 1524, coming in from Guatemala being led by Pedro de Alvarado. The Pipil initially welcomed the Spanish, but once the Spaniards began attacking them and taking their land, the Pipil fought back. The Spanish, however, had superior weapons and tactics, and were massacring the Pipil people, torturing, killing, and raping anyone in their way and enslaving those who survived. It's estimated that in Spain's first 50 years of occupation, they killed about 425,000 of the indigenous population. The Spanish were consistently pushing back Pipil boundaries, seizing more land in the process until they neared Cuscatlan, at which point their expedition began to slow down, as Pipil resistance grew stronger closer to their home. Eventually, though, in 1528, Spain was able to take control of three-quarters of the land and establish San Salvador as the region's capital. San Salvador had actually been founded in 1525, but they kept losing control before regaining it before losing it again. It was only in 1528 that they actually maintained that control. The fighting, however, continued for another 11 years before Spain had total control and completely dominated the Pipil. About 300 years later, sentiments of independence began to grow, especially amongst Salvadoran indigo farmers. The indigo market was boom and bust in El Salvador, and as such, the farmers were unhappy with the economy under the Spanish regime. On top of that, the market was controlled by Guatemalan merchants rather than Salvadoran ones. This was also coupled with the desire for the province to have its own bishop rather than having to rely on the Guatemalan archbishop, which led to multiple independence movements from 1811 to 1821. Finally, on September 15th, 1821, El Salvador, along with multiple other Central American provinces, successfully seceded from Spain when they adopted the Act of Independence of Central America, doing so peacefully and without any bloodshed, in contrast with El Salvador's previous attempts. 3 years later, in 1824, the Central American Constitutional Convention was held, where a constitution was drafted and the Federal Republic of Central America was formed, consisting of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, although it eventually dissolved in 1841, following years of civil war and revolutions, at which point in 1838, most of the countries left, but El Salvador stuck around until 1841. Now, by the end of the 1800s, the majority of the land in El Salvador was owned by an oligarchy consisting of 14 families, known as La Catorce. These families had devised a legal and economic system that forced peasants to lose their land and, in turn, be forced to work for the oligarchy for extremely low wages. It was a crime not to work at least a portion of the year as a wage laborer. And with the government seizing land from the indigenous people, they were consistently giving it to the families and ensuring that because these people had no other source of income, they had to work on the farms. The oligarchy also found it was more profitable to export their goods rather than sell to the Salvadoran people, and as such, focused production on coffee, sugarcane, and cotton. Eventually, though, in the 1920s, there was a massive decline in the value of coffee, which led to the families taking even more land from the people, as well as cutting worker wages in half, in order to compensate their own losses. Communist, socialist, and populist sentiments began to grow, and people began voting in members of the Communist Party. However, the oligarchs did not allow said elected officials to assume their positions, and instead banned any communists from taking part in the government. As a result, peasants, specifically the indigenous people, became angry and began an insurrection, going on strike, demanding better wages, working conditions, and social reform. In response to this, the government sent out death squads and massacred approximately 30,000 people in a single week, an event now known as La Matanza. A military government then took over and began persecuting the indigenous people and oppressing peasants in general. Indigenous people from that point forward had to hide their cultural identity in order to avoid imprisonment, torture, and even death. The country also became a dictatorship as elections were fraudulent, always ensuring the right-wing military party would win. From that point forward, American companies also started to use Salvadoran labor, given the fact that the worker wages were so low and there was a lack of regulation, ensuring a cheap manufacturing cost. And as such, the American government even began to provide financial support to the Salvadoran government to ensure this would continue. Following decades of dictatorship, finally in the 1970s, student groups, labor groups, religious leaders, and citizens in general began another push for reform. Once again, death squads were sent out, executing anyone tied to what they were calling the popular movement. In retaliation, people started setting up rural communities and formed an armed resistance, the Farabundo Marti Front for National Liberation, or the FMLN. The purpose of the group was to establish a democratic government with a true electoral process, as well as establishing themselves as the left-leaning party of the country. With the formation of the FMLN, a civil war began. The U.S. supported El Salvador's government and sent even more military aid and financial aid in order to ensure that the insurrection was suppressed. It's estimated that throughout the 1980s, under President Ronald Reagan, the U.S. was sending $1 to $2 million a day. It was also at the recommendation of U.S. military advisors that the Salvadoran government began attacking what they believed to be FMLN zones of control, mainly through bombing. The U.S. instructed the regime to treat anyone in these zones as enemy guerrilla warriors, and as a result, anyone living in these areas, regardless of whether they were in the FMLN or not, were killed. Some people may have even been in support of the military regime, but given their geographic location, were executed anyways. It's estimated that because of these tactics, a quarter of El Salvador's population was dispersed, as people were fleeing to nations like Honduras, Mexico, and the US in order to avoid death. Human rights violations became constant throughout the war, with people regularly being imprisoned, killed, or simply disappearing. It got to a point where a group of mothers even formed an organization in order to look for these missing people, but they were treated much the same as the FMLN at the hands of the government. One of the most notable atrocities was the El Mazoto massacre on December 11, 1981, in which a U.S.-trained battalion went searching for FMLN members in a village, but when they found none, decided to execute 800 civilians anyways. Another example is when in 1989, a death squad executed 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and the housekeeper's daughter, seemingly at random. Finally, in 1992, the UN stepped in and sponsored a peace accord that the government and the FMLN signed, finally recognizing the group as a political party. This helped bring an end to the civil war, although violence continued, as people were still wary of the government and the electoral process, because as I mentioned earlier, the country's past elections had been rigged. Since then, El Salvador's main priority has been dealing with gang violence and violence in general. Political instability in the country has made it very easy for gangs like MS-13 to establish themselves and flourish. And because of financial mismanagement, along with general corruption, law enforcement has struggled to keep gangs contained. It's gone to a point where some police have even fled the country in order to avoid facing off with the gangs and possibly dying. Now, given the fact that El Salvador and Central America as a whole have so many gangs and cartels killing people, wreaking havoc, and trafficking illegal drugs and weapons, it's become their most pressing concern. One of the biggest issues has been the deportation of gang members from the U.S. to El Salvador, which is actually how these gangs spread to the country. MS-13 is the most notable gang in Central America, and it was actually formed in the U.S., consisting of children who had escaped the Salvadoran Civil War. But once they were jailed, released, they were immediately deported back to El Salvador. And because these ex-convicts usually have no ties to the country beyond having emigrated from there as a child, they struggle to integrate into the new society and more often than not simply return to crime, as they know nothing else. The deportations are often done with little to no warning as well, leaving the Salvadoran government unprepared on how to handle it, especially because of how many ex-convicts are coming in, which has increased by 140% since 2017. Now, the U.S. has been a long-standing ally to El Salvador's government, and that distinction is important for later. Relations opened up between the two countries in 1863, and as I mentioned earlier, since the 1930s, the U.S. has been providing financial support to El Salvador. The government has been funding programs in El Salvador to help with economic growth, reduction of crime, gang violence, as well as illegal immigration. It is, however, questioned how much these American programs have actually helped El Salvador, as experts pointed out that at the height of U.S. funding during the 80s, which was $1 to $2 million a day, El Salvador was actually worse off. But I'll be touching on that point a little more later. El Salvador and the U.S. are also involved in multiple free trade agreements, such as the U.S. Central America Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, and the Salvadoran government even deployed about 300 troops in 2003 in order to assist the U.S. in their war in Afghanistan. Guatemala is another ally of El Salvador's, although it's important to note that throughout the 1800s, Guatemala repeatedly tried to overthrow and take over El Salvador's government, along with every other government in Central America. However, after a change in leadership, those attempts came to an end. Now, the two countries share many social values, as well as the religion of Catholicism, as well as having a lot of historical similarities, given the fact that they're both former Spanish colonies who seceded together and formed the FRCA together. I already mentioned that drug cartels in both countries have meant that they've had to often work together in order to provide a united front and address the issue. Taiwan, up until recently, was also an ally of El Salvador's. The two countries had been involved in free trade, and El Salvador was one of the few countries to recognize Taiwan as an independent nation separate from China. El Salvador, however, in the last couple of years had been making demands that Taiwan refused to accept, such as asking for funding for a major port project, which the Taiwanese deemed to be a financial risk that would put both countries in severe debt. China took advantage of this rift and offered El Salvador a rather lucrative deal that included a $150 million funding package for social and infrastructural programs. However, as part of the deal, El Salvador had to end relations with Taiwan and refuse the recognition of the country's independence, as China themselves do not recognize Taiwan's sovereignty and demand that their close allies do the same. As such, El Salvador complied and cut relations with Taiwan and renounced their recognition of the country's independence. Now, I mentioned I'd be coming back to the U.S. because the Americans have been an enemy to the Salvadoran people. The aid that the U.S. was providing was going directly to oppressing the people of El Salvador and resulted in numerous human rights violations. The beginning of the funds actually coincided with the establishment of the dictatorship, with the purpose of continuing to underpay workers and ensuring that they were essentially exploited, which would benefit the American companies. And I mentioned that it was the U.S. who instructed the Salvadoran government to execute everyone in the zones of control, regardless of whether they were actually part of the resistance. So even though the U.S. was an ally to the Salvadoran government, their actions led directly to the suffering and death of the Salvadoran people. El Salvador and Honduras were also enemies in the 60s, when tensions between the two countries culminated in what is now known as the Football War, the 100-Hour War. Throughout the 1900s, approximately 300,000 Salvadorans immigrated from the country to Honduras, as Honduras is significantly larger with a smaller population, meaning more job opportunities. This angered many Honduran laborers who felt that the Salvadorans were stealing jobs, and it led to the country's government holding mass deportations. The Salvadoran government was unsure what to do with so many people coming in, and with many reports of the Salvadoran immigrants being persecuted, raped, and killed by the Hondurans, tensions were on the rise. This was coupled with the fact that there had been a long-standing dispute over the border between the two countries and who has what part of the land. Eventually, the conflict boiled over, and following a World Cup qualifier football match between the two nations on June 27, 1969, in which El Salvador beat Honduras, they immediately severed ties after the game, and on July 14th bombed the Honduran military base. The war lasted 4 days and took 2,000 lives before the Organization of American States demanded a ceasefire. In terms of reputation, El Salvador is known as one of the most dangerous countries in the world. I've already mentioned the rather high crime rate with a lot of gang violence, corruption, and political instability. And while the homicide rate has been on the decline after having peaked at 2012 at 105 murders per 100,000 people, now down to 36 murders per 100,000 people, it's still much higher than most other countries in the world. The fact of the matter is, El Salvador is a country that's been marred by civil strife, violence, oppression, and inequality. And while steps have been taken in the right direction these last couple decades, such as reinstating their electoral process to some extent, there's still a long way to go for the country to address all the issues the nation faces. Thank you for listening. That's the end.
Thank you for sharing. All right. So who's next there? Katerina?
Yeah.
Sir, I'm here. I just came late.
Who's here? Who's that?
Mark.
Oh, Mark. All right. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks.
Is Jacob there yet? No, Jacob? All right.
So for my country, I chose Cuba. And here's like a little description. Cuba, officially known as the Republic of Cuba, is a country comprising the island of Cuba as well as several minor group of islands. Cuba is located in the northern Caribbean, where the Caribbean Sea, Gulf of Mexico, and Atlantic Ocean meet. The area of the Republic of Cuba is 110,000 square kilometers, not including the territorial waters. The main island is the largest island in Cuba and in the Caribbean. It is also the second most populous island in the Caribbean with over 11 million inhabitants. Though Cuba's history began much like other Caribbean nations, which is discovered by Columbus or colonized by the Spanish, it has taken strange path ever since. The Spanish-American War transformed Cuba into the Republic of Cuba. During the year of 1929, Cuba saw a tourism boom with American hotels, restaurants, and businesses appearing up all over the island, which is when its golden age began. Officially, Cuba is a socialist country with the intent of becoming communist. Its laws allow for only one party to exist, the Cuban Communist Party. So you could say that the country is ruled by a communist ideology, though the government admits that it hasn't yet built an entirely communist society. The Cuban Revolution of Independence. As early as 1790, the idea of independence was popular in Cuba in some groups. The first attempt at a revolution took place in 1791, led by Jose Antonio Aponte. However, it failed, and over the next 30 years, no other serious uprisings occurred, although the idea of freedom was never forgotten. The next serious attempt took place in 1850, commanded by Narciso Lopez, who had conspired against Spain in New York. He arrived in Cuba with 600 men. They managed to conquer Cardenas, but they did not achieve popular support and had to abandon the island. A few more failed attempts occurred over the next few years until executions of conspirators began in 1855, and there was a relative calm for more than 10 years. In the 19th century, sugarcane production began to be mechanized by technology created during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a period beginning around 1760, during which raw materials such as iron and steel and energy sources such as coal and electricity led to the replacement of human handiwork by automated machines. Wealthy immigrants from Spain controlled both these new means of production, as well as Cuba's colonial government, resulting in policies and taxes that oppressed small landowners, laborers, and slaves. Meanwhile, from 1810 to 1825, Spain's remaining colonies in the New World revolted against the empire and achieved their independence, leaving only Cuba and Puerto Rico under Spanish control. However, the Spanish-American War resulted in a Spanish withdrawal from the island in 1898, and following 3.5 years of subsequent U.S. military rule, Cuba gained formal independence in 1902. Cuban leaders. From the moment Cuba became an independent republic in 1902, it has had 16 presidents, one of which is currently in office. The president of Cuba's name is Miguel Diaz-Canel. However, the most influential leader of Cuba was Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro studied law at the University of Havana. He was a Cuban revolutionary and a politician who served as the country's 16th prime minister from February 16, 1959 to December 2nd, 1976. He also led the Cuban Revolution, which was against the authoritarian ruling of President Fulgencio Batista. He was the first president of the Council of Ministers of Cuba, where he served from December 2nd, 1976 to February 24th, 2008. He transformed his country into the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. Castro became a symbol of communist revolution in Latin America. A significant event that occurred in Cuban history is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is also known as the October Crisis of 1962, the Caribbean Crisis, or the Missile Scare. It was a 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, initiated by Soviet ballistic missile deployment in Cuba. The confrontation is often considered the closest the Cold War came to escalating into a full-scale nuclear war. And this is like a timeline of significant events that occurred. So on October 12, 1492, the island of Guanahani, now known as Cuba, is found. October 7th, 1886, slavery is abolished in Cuba. April 25th, 1898, the United States declares war on Spain. August 12, 1898, the Spanish-American War ends. June 16th, 1900, the first elections took place. May 20th, 1902, Cuba gains formal independence. January 7th, 1958, the United States recognizes Castro as leader of Cuba. January 1st, 1959, the Cuban Revolution happens. February 13th, 1960, Cuba becomes a part of the USSR. January 31st, 1962, the US begins to get information suggesting that Russia is placing missiles in Cuba. October 14th, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis begins. October 28th, 1962, the end of Cuban Missile Crisis. October 16th, 1982, Cuba officially has the largest armed forces in Latin America. And December 16th, 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart at this time, which heavily affected Cuban economy and obviously in a negative way. The Cuban government continues to employ arbitrary detention to harass and intimidate critics, independent activists, political opponents, and others. The number of arbitrary short-term detentions, which increased dramatically between 2010 and 2016, from a monthly average of 172 incidents to 827, started to drop in 2017, according to the Cuban Commission of Human Rights and National Reconciliation, an independent human rights group that the government considers illegal. And this was a recent issue that has been solved. The government controls virtually all media outlets in Cuba and restricts access to outside information. A small number of independent journalists and bloggers manage to write articles for websites or blogs or publish tweets. The government routinely blocks access within Cuba to these websites, and only a fraction of Cubans can read independent websites and blogs because of the high cost of and limited access to the internet. In September 2017, Cuba announced it would gradually extend home internet services. However, this is still a occurring issue. Foreign relations. Cuba's foreign policy has been fluid throughout history depending on world events and other variables, including relations with the United States. Without massive Soviet subsidies and its primary trading partner, Cuba became increasingly isolated in the late 1980s and early 1990s after the fall of the USSR and the end of the Cold War. But Cuba opened up more with the rest of the world again starting in the late 1990s, when they have since entered bilateral cooperation with several South American countries, most notably Venezuela and Bolivia, especially after the Venezuela election of Hugo Chavez in 1999, who became an ally of Castro's Cuba. The United States used to stick to a policy of isolating Cuba until December 2014, when Barack Obama announced a new policy of diplomatic and economic engagement. The European Union accuses Cuba of continuing flagrant violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Cuba has developed a growing relationship with the People's Republic of China and Russia. In all, Cuba continues to have formal relations with 160 nations and provides civilian assistant workers, principally medical, in more than 20 nations. More than 1 million exiles have escaped to foreign countries. Cuba is currently a lead country on the United Nations Human Rights Council and is a founding member of the organization known as the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, a member of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the Latin American Integration Association, and the United Nations. Cuba is a member of Non-Aligned Movement and hosted its September 2006 summit. In addition, as a member of the Association of Caribbean States, Cuba was reappointed as the chair of the Special Committee on Transportation Issues for the Caribbean region. Following a meeting on November 2004, several leaders of South America have attempted to make Cuba either a full associate member of the South American trade bloc known as Mercosur. Cuba is a small archipelago in the Caribbean, which the world hardly spoke of before 1959. It was one of the most poorest and underdeveloped, illiterate, and unhealthy countries in the world, which was only any good for foreign agricultural companies, mostly the US, for 60 years, who made great profits at the expense of Cuban hunger and misery. However, when the revolution triumphed and came into power, everything began to change. Educated and internationalism without selfishness, and offering those who need a little of what they have, the Cuban people's solidarity efforts and altruism have ensured the friendships of most countries. From the gratitude of African nations for the role Cuba played in the way history played out on its continent, to its medical collaborations in over 165 countries, Cuba has soured friendships which has immeasurable values. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. All right. Who is third? Sabrina?
Yep. Can you guys see?
Yes.
All right, cool. So today I'm going to be talking about worker co-ops. So first, I think the first thing we got to do is define what a worker co-op is. So today I'm going to be focusing on 4 articles that I found, 2 from center-left sources and 2 from center-right sources. So a worker co-op, as defined by the New York Times and by The Atlantic. So the New York Times is saying that in a worker co-op, the workers own the business and they decide what to do with the profits. And The Atlantic is saying in worker cooperatives, decision-making is democratic, so each worker has 1 vote, and policies can't be determined by an investor whose only priority is profit. And then, as defined by the center-right sources, Washington Times is saying the employees at a worker co-op get a say in how their business is run, and they get a cut of the profits. And Bloomberg is saying companies owned by a worker cooperative is a company owned by the people who work for those companies. So I want to talk about the bias I found in these articles. So 2 of these 4 articles were actually editorials, not part of the news section, the Bloomberg and the New York Times. They were both editorials. However, I found that they weren't like overtly opinionated. Rather, like they exemplified bias in more subtle ways, like they're reframing the situation. And I'm going to show you. But first, before that, I want to talk about the pros and cons. So some basic pros of a worker cooperative is that it addresses wealth inequality at its core. There's no, like, the government's not like saying you got to redistribute wealth and like affecting policy change. It's looking at why wealth is unequal, and it's addressing it directly from its root. And it doesn't affect the consumer. As a consumer, the quality of your goods is not going to change just because workers can organize themselves. And there's been some studies that have shown that there's some intangible benefits, such as boosting worker morale or boosting productivity. However, they're very hard to get off the ground because banks and other lenders tend to distrust co-ops. They'd rather invest in a singular person who owns some capital. And there's been other studies that have shown that the intangible side effects are questionable. Like some studies have shown that the productivity is only marginal, and that morale is like something that doesn't affect productivity and other things like that. And one of the biggest cons is that more competent workers may seek work elsewhere. So that was one of the arguments in the Bloomberg and the New York Times articles. So I want to compare the way that they're spinning the story, because they're both editorials, but they're not overtly opinionated. They look at the success of a co-op and they imply to the reader why the co-op is good. Like they both seem to have mildly positive views towards co-ops, and they're both mildly critical, but they examine these things in different ways. So one of the arguments against a co-op is cooperatives might suffer from distorted incentives. A traditional corporation has to pay high ability employees to stay, but co-ops don't see that much variation in pay. So Bloomberg is saying that democratic redistribution within cooperatives dulls effort. So skilled and ambitious workers will quit co-ops and join traditional corporations. And New York Times doesn't seem to disagree. They're saying it's true, but not all cooperatives have to be the next Apple, have to be the next Microsoft. It's fine. It's good enough for the workers to just get by. And like the arguments are not inherently all that different, but it reframes the way the viewer sees co-ops, and that affects how they interact with this concept going forward. And I think it doesn't show that like, oh, there's more or less bias. This reveals the goals of these different outlets in relation to worker co-ops. Like, do they want growth or stability? Do they want endless expansion, or do they just want to be satisfied and content? So I want to talk about another way bias is used. So I want to talk about bias by omission. In the New York Times article, there weren't that many statistics that the Bloomberg one used. Like if you see the links that are highlighted in the screenshot, when I was reading the article, those links took me to studies that back up the argument that is being made by the Bloomberg article. And out of the 4 articles I've talked about, only the Bloomberg one had any statistics in their arguments at all. And I think this is a very clear case of bias by omission, because like they're not lying or even spinning the statistics in a way that benefits them. They're simply leaving them out, and that's like an important bias that we should be looking out for, even in more moderate or centrist media like these ones. So, like in the center left articles, they tended to rely on covering individual successful co-ops and explaining their success, whereas Bloomberg was looking at broader trends. And the Washington Times article was just giving like a rough overview with not a lot of substance in either regard. So on the topic of bias by omission, when I was looking for articles to cover for this presentation, I found a handful of progressive outlets such as Vox, Medium, Huffington Post, but I didn't find any overtly right-wing ones. I went on most mainstream right-wing media. I went on Fox, I went on Daily Beast, I went on these outlets, and I couldn't find anything about worker co-ops. So that they just ignore the topic, and I think that reveals a bias like within these outlets as well. So for this presentation, I opted to show these center left and center right articles because I don't want to cause you guys to have a distorted view of worker co-ops because of this, because for some of you guys, it's probably your first exposure to this concept. However, if I had found any right-wing journalists covering this topic, I would not have shown these 4 largely unbiased articles. I would have shown the biased left-wing ones and the biased right-wing ones, because here's the thing: what's the alternative if you can't find biased articles from across the aisle? So I think I don't think we can avoid bias, and I don't think bias is a bad thing. I think the pursuit of trying to avoid bias is futile. And instead, we should be trying to consume different types of media from across the aisle, understanding how it's biased and forming our own judgments based on the different perspectives we read. So the alternative, I think, is to look at alternative media. Instead of focusing primarily on quote-unquote unbiased mainstream media, we should be opening our eyes and broadening our horizons to alternative media, because I don't know about you guys, but a lot of things I've only been exposed to through alternative media. I was only exposed to what a worker co-op is through alternative media. And I think it's a good way to find information that the mainstream media has decided to ignore. Like, you could probably find like lots of alternative right-wing sources covering worker co-ops and explaining like their faults or their shortcomings. And I'd like to point out that bias does not always equal factually inaccurate. Getting information from a lot of sources, biased or otherwise, is best in my opinion, but obviously you're free to do what you want. And I think it's wrong to pretend that just because a media appears unbiased, like the 4 articles I've shown, it's media appears unbiased is not inherently better than media that is overtly biased, like at least all the time. And that sentimentality can be detrimental, because like being a moderate, being a centrist, being nonpartisan is inherently political by nature. And instead of trying to like seek out what you believe is the most unbiased media as to not skew your opinion or whatever, you should be just critically consuming media from like everywhere, and then using that kind of media to create your own opinion. So that leaves me with my questions. One is about co-ops. Do you think co-ops are a good way to reduce wealth inequality without disturbing the status quo? And one is about bias. Do you think it's better to seek out perceptibly unbiased media or multiple sources of biased media when forming an opinion about a new concept?
Thank you for sharing. Anybody?
Hi. So can I? So I don't know about co-ops that much, but like about bias, I think, like you said, it is better to seek multiple medias, because at the end everything is biased, so you can't really find an unbiased media to take your sources, and there are always multiple sides to a story, so using every kinds of media you can, like alternative media, the news, the newspaper, all of those are really helpful.
Okay. Anyone else? Fantastic. Thank you, Sabrina. So I guess Sada is going to go now, and then followed by Hope, and then we'll continue on. We have a lot more today, too.
Yep. Okay. Let me just... Okay. You guys can all see that?
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. So the country that I've chosen is New Zealand. Beautiful. This is a picture of it during the winter. Some of its very nice scenery. Okay, so New Zealand is an island country that is located in the southwestern Pacific Ocean. This country consists of two main land masses, the North Island and the South Island. Furthermore, New Zealand's population has now reached 5 million people in March of 2020. The culture of New Zealand is now a Western culture influenced by the marvelous environment and geographic isolation of the islands, and is widely known for its uniquely cultural input of the indigenous Maori people, alongside the multi-ethnic migration that followed the British colonization of New Zealand. The people have greatly and uniquely ingrained their culture into New Zealand land. The people that have, so this is the table of contents, sorry. So that's the first slide. So the people that have greatly and uniquely ingrained their culture into the New Zealand land are the Maori people, who are the indigenous inhabitants of New Zealand. The Maori people originated with settlers from eastern Polynesian islands, traveling to New Zealand through canoe voyages between the time of 1250 and 1300. The Maori people, however, dictate through oral history that Coop was the first navigator to reach New Zealand's shores, alongside his peoples, through a long voyage from Hawaii, the mythical homeland in tropical Polynesia, which is where they came from to truly settle the islands. Within New Zealand, Maori peoples have developed a distinct culture over 700 years. Maori are the Tangata Whenua, which translates to the indigenous peoples of New Zealand. Inhabiting New Zealand over 1,000 years ago, they have influenced New Zealand's culture greatly. Today, 1 in 7 New Zealanders identify as Maori. In a 2018 census, it was recorded that 7,075,836 people in New Zealand identified as Maori. This ultimately makes up 16.5% of the national population. The Maori history, language, and traditions are central to New Zealand's identity. In contrast to Canada and our relationship with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, Maori is an official language in New Zealand, and it is common to hear Te Reo Maori spoken in communities. It is even implemented within the school system, and many official places in New Zealand are named in Maori. Why is this? Well, in the 1800s, the Maori culture started to undergo a renaissance through multiple aspects, such as the revival of the Maori Language Act in 1987, the land-focused Maori protest movement, the Spring Tour in 1981 led to international connections with other indigenous peoples, and the Te Maori art exhibition in 1984 to 1987. Since then, they have been a renewed focus on biculturalism, which is based on partnership between the Maori and the Crown by the Treaty of Wang Tai. Who are the former rulers of or colonial powers? New Zealand's colonial powers. Firstly, a Dutchman, Abel Tasman, was the first European to sight the country in December of 1642. The Dutch explorer anchored the South Island in Golden Bay and was the first to sketch a map of both islands, west coast. However, the British made New Zealand part of their empire due to France's increased interest. In 1769, Captain James Cook made the first of 3 expeditions to New Zealand and its surroundings. Trading ensued, and by the 1830s, the British government had decided it was time to curb the lawlessness of the land and officially make it a colony. On February 6, 1940, New Zealand's first governor, William Hobson, who was prior a British Royal Navy officer, and the Maori chiefs were invited to sign the country's founding document, known as the Treaty of Wang Tai. This treaty was taken all around the country to be signed by the local chiefs. Over 500 tribal chiefs from the North and South Islands of New Zealand were present that day. The treaty was an agreement between the British Crown and Maori, which established British law in New Zealand. For this beautiful country, the Golden Age economically involved the boom of travel. In 2018, New Zealand's international visitor arrivals reached a staggering 3.9 million. This calculated to a growth of 35% in 5 years. This tourism growth was driven by the increase of arrivals from Australia and Taiwan. Tourism became an essential source of income within this country and for its citizens. This industry expanded between 2010 and 2018 from 25.6 billion to 39.1 billion. Furthermore, tourism employs a significant amount of New Zealanders by directly or indirectly employing 14.4% of the employed citizens within New Zealand. New Zealand is worldly known for its beautiful travel destinations. And actually, in 2018, Telegraph Travel Awards New Zealand won the best country in the world and has had the winning position for 6 years. New Zealand is no longer a British colony, and in 1907, it became the Dominion of New Zealand and gained full legal dependence when Parliament passed the Constitution Act in 1986. Steps towards independence include New Zealand passing the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act in 1947 and gaining legal and formal independence from Britain. In the exercise of its external affairs, and in 2003, a new Supreme Court was created, replacing Britain's Privy Council as New Zealand's final court of appeal. Similar to Canada, Queen Elizabeth, however, is still the head of state. So, what is the relationship of boundaries to historical and ethnic and tribal boundaries? Due to the ingrained and accepted culture, New Zealand and the Maori culture have had a symbiotic relationship. Nonetheless, the Maori culture has greater impacts depending on where you live within the country. 86% of Maori people have been recorded living in the North Islands. Furthermore, 25% of the Maori people are living in Auckland. Over 10% of the Maori population lives in Waikato. Living or working in these areas will force you to experience the Maori culture regularly. I have posted onto the slide a map. So first is the map of New Zealand when you look at just the country and its geographic, but then you look at the map onto what is my left and it says Iwi Tribes of New Zealand. So it's the country, however, it's broken up in the different tribes of the Maori culture. And you can see just where some of the tribes are located mainly. So, what are the significant military, political, economic, and social events that have shaped your country's views? In 1993, a binding referendum throughout the country occurred. This led New Zealand to replace its original voting system from the first past the post system to the mixed member proportional method, MMP, which is thought to be more inclusive. This was one of the most dramatic changes within New Zealand's electoral history prior to the women's suffrage movement. This political change allowed the opportunity for more political parties to emerge, ultimately hoping to display Parliament as greatly representative of the society at large, mainly reflecting what is now New Zealand's critical views. Another economic and social event that shaped New Zealand's views occurred on September 19th, 1893. This day was when New Zealand became the first self-governing country to grant women the right to vote in parliamentary elections, ultimately recognizing women as people under the law. The Electoral Act was signed into an official law by Governor Lord Glasgow. This law was established after years of suffrage movements and many petitions. Many of these campaigns were led by the famously known Kate Sheppard and were inspired by the American-based Women's Christian Temperance Union that was one of the first organizations aiming to create social reform. New Zealand was one of the first countries to allow women to vote, and it is widely reflects their moral values. Furthermore, a military event that significantly shaped New Zealand's views was the Second World War. New Zealand's participation within this war ended up resulting in the country's most significant national effort. This is because the Second World War involved a greater amount of mobilization of people and resources. During the war, 140,000 men and women served overseas, 104,000 served in the Second New Zealand Expeditionary Force, and the remaining aided and served in British or New Zealand naval or air forces. Ultimately, in total, 194,000 men and 10,000 women served in the armed forces, and almost 12,000 of them lost their lives tragically. During this tragic event of the Second World War, due to the nature of the Second World War, it granted New Zealanders the ability to develop a sense of identity as a country, while also greatly increasing the country's citizens' confidence in their role within the world. What does the country see as the most important world problem? When considering the world during a quantified thematic analysis of the responses of a nationally representative sample of 999 New Zealanders, the leading economic issue reported involved financial problems, cost of living, rising prices, unemployment, taxation, poverty, the gap between the rich and poor, economic problems such as housing affordability, homelessness, lack of housing, overpopulation, globalization, and fairer world trade. However, the single biggest world problem reported through this sample is global warming and climate change, beating economic issues by just 4%. These environmental issues include global warming, climate change, water conservation, environmental degradation, and pollution, rubbish, famine, food storages, cutting down rainforests, desertification, natural disasters, and other environmental issues. So the two photos I've posted onto this slide are actually the polls themselves. These were answered by 999 New Zealanders, and you can see the percentages. So economic issues were winning when it came to facing New Zealand, the most important problems facing New Zealand, and the environmental issues and economic issues that New Zealand found to be one of the two greatest problems are tied within percents. Who are your traditional allies and enemies? New Zealand allies are quickly identified as the United States, Britain, and Australia. This is due to the Australian, New Zealand, and United States Security Treaty, the ANZUS Treaty. This treaty was established in 1951 and is a collective security non-binding agreement between Australia and New Zealand, alongside separately Australia and the United States. The goal of this treaty is to cooperate on military matters within the Pacific region. So these are the most known and rectified New Zealand allies. How does it see its role in world affairs? New Zealand is extremely active within world affairs. In 1998, New Zealand set up the Ministry of External Relations and Trade. Nonetheless, in 1933, this became the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. In 2020, New Zealand had diplomatic relations within around 150 countries. This is due to their prominent role throughout history. In 1945, New Zealand was actively involved in drafting and establishing the United Nations. From 1950, New Zealand played a major role within the Colombo Plan. This plan assisted developing countries through the plan. New Zealand has provided Asian countries with technical assistance and capital. Furthermore, New Zealand continues to be prominent within multilateral organizations such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. New Zealand helps negotiate norms and rules on the issues such as trade, human rights, arms control, and the environmental issues facing the world today. What is your country's reputation in the world? How do others view you? I feel a country's reputation within the world is highly represented by its leader. In New Zealand's case, it is outstanding. Throughout this pandemic, all eyes have turned towards Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern due to her world-leading role handling the coronavirus. October 20th, New Zealand had less than 1,900 confirmed coronavirus cases and 25 deaths. That calculates closely to 320 cases per million people, so successfully eradicating the transmission of the virus. Ardern is the leader of the centre-left Labour Party. Recently, her re-election has shocked tabloids, securing 49% of the vote and a majority of the seats within Parliament. Furthermore, she gained world's fame, becoming the second world leader to have a baby while in office. She also brought it to the United Nations during a conference. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much.
How do
All right.
I unshare?
Top of the screen, I think it says end.
yeah.
Now.
Good?
Good. How about Hope?
Okay, so okay. Can you see? Can you
Yes.
guys see it?
It works.
Okay. Why isn't it? Do you only see the presentation or do you see everything? Because
I see your
it's being weird
presentation
on my screen.
and your cursor. That's it.
Okay, so my country that I chose is South Africa. So this is the flag. Basically, before any colonizers went there, it was populated by the Bantu people, and they've lived there for thousands of years before. And basically, it's a large variety of people who speak their native language, which is the Bantu languages, and they make up around several hundred indigenous ethnic groups across Africa. And here's a picture of the Zulu people, and they're a Bantu-speaking tribe that is still there today, located in South Africa. So, the first people to go there that weren't non-natives were the Portuguese in 1486, and then later other European countries followed. So in 1806, the British established the Cape Colony, which is now South Africa, and with the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, and the colony became the province of the Cape of Good Hope, also called Cape Province. And in World War II, This caused more African political movements, which were at first ruled by the British, to take power, and it was not good because when the National Party got voted in 1948, it led to the decolonization of the natives, and it also led to a policy called apartheid. And it basically discriminated everyone who was of color, and it segregated them. Basically, like what was happening with the natives in Canada and the black people and the white people in America. And South Africa supported and helped Britain fight in both World War I and World War II, but they are their own separate country now. They're not a British colony. So, on May 31st in 1961, South Africa became their own country and they separated from Britain. Many people who fought to end the apartheid were thrown in jail for their activism and their I don't know the word, but Nelson Mandela is one of these activists, and he served very long terms in jail for his anti-apartheid activism. But this eventually led him to becoming president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999, and it did take a good turnaround. And Nelson Mandela, along with F.W. de Klerk, he was a politician. They both helped end the apartheid system, and they both won Nobel Prizes for it. It was like a split prize. And now South Africa is their own independent country and often referred to as the Rainbow Nation to represent their multicultural diversity. So you can see that they've come a long way from where they started. So these are some very important events in the history. So of course, like we talked about, colonization, because this led to basically all of the major important events in history, which would be the apartheid system. The First and Second Anglo-Boer War, I hope I'm saying that right, but this was very important because the First War happened from December 1880 until March 1881, and the reason behind this was because the British wanted to take control over the trade routes to India that passed through here, and they were fighting over huge mineral deposits that were found and big mines, and Britain was just trying to continue to expand their colonization throughout Africa, as they usually do. Um, the Second War was also fought by the British Empire on one side and two Boer states on the other. So the South African Republic and the Orange Free State were fighting against Britain. And this one was about the gold and the minerals that were found because Britain wanted to take control over it. Another one is the Union of South Africa in 1910. This is basically when 4 colonies that were conquered by the British Empire, they formed together and they lived under the British Commonwealth, and that was Natal, Cape, Orange Free State, and Transvaal United, and they all formed together. Once again, independence, that was very important, and Nelson Mandela, because he was the first Black president, and it was very important for their culture and to get out of the apartheid system. And they all shaped South Africa to the country we know today. So I wasn't really sure about this question, but I think South Africa's golden age was definitely before the British went to colonize it because they were peaceful and they were living their best lives. But as for the future, I think they definitely have another golden age because they still have a really long way to go to becoming the perfect country, I guess, because their crime rates are really high and they have a lot of human rights issues, but they're working on it. But a very important part that could be considered the golden age was when Nelson Mandela did become president and they started to end racism. And yeah. So worldview. This is a map of South Africa. So basically South Africa is a part of the non-aligned movement, which means that they aren't aligned with any of the larger powers and they're kind of neutral. they don't really have any enemies because of this, but they do participate in peacekeeping operations and they help send troops to those African trouble spots when either the United Nations or the African Union calls for such involvement. But this doesn't include Zimbabwe because they have a kind of rocky relationship with them. But they do have a lot of trading partners, which includes the SADC region, which is Southern Africa, Brazil, South Africa, as well as India, and a lot of the bigger powers too. So, what does your country see as the most important world problem? Considering South Africa's history with racism and segregation, I would imagine that human rights would be on the top of their list. They still have a really long way to go with super high crime rates, poverty, and a lot of that stuff, but they are continuously working on changing and improving for the better. So, how is your country viewed by the world? A BBC World Service 2013 countries rating poll has revealed that the global sentiment towards South Africa remains positive overall, but only just. The poll was conducted with among 26,299 people around the world between December 2012 and April 2013, and they asked their respondents to rate 16 countries, the EU, on whether their influence in the world is mostly positive or mostly negative. And South Africa was positive overall and has definitely improved from when they did it the last time, but it was 53 to 50, with the 53 being the positive. So you can see that it's kind of 50-50, but it's improved a lot. So thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
Thank you. No, I don't know. That was good. Yeah. We might still watch a film called My Country or something before the end of this class, and it takes place after apartheid is abolished. It's moving. Yeah, fantastic. Why don't we take a 7 to 10 minute break? How does that sound, everybody? And then who's next? So that was Hope. Still have Tyler to go. I think we have a number of people.
Where can I go next?
Whose can I go next? Jethro?
Right.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Jethro, 10 minutes, 9:55. Okay.